Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. This is part 2 on our grain yield data series, and hopefully our final one if we can get through everything, but we'll see. And today we really want to focus on how we can effectively use yield data and also its limitations. So if you are using it as a decision-making layer, we want to make sure that you're using it properly and that you're putting good information into whatever decision you're making, whether it be fertility, inputs, all of those things. So let's get started here. Again, we have Dr. John Fulton with us. Go ahead and introduce yourself, John.
Yeah, thanks for having me back again. John Fulton as an extension specialist in the Food, Ag, and Biological Engineering Department here at Ohio State.
Yeah, so yield data, again, we talked about last time the financial implications of the decisions that you're placing on that data layer if you are using it to make purchasing decisions on inputs, whether that be fertilizer, whether that be seed, any input really that you bring data from a yield monitor into. Since the 90s, we've really had this promise in precision ag with the introduction of the yield monitor on farms that it's going to provide the data that we need to manage at a site-specific level, down to the inch in some cases, a foot by foot or plant by plant. And the reality of that data is that it's still attached to a combine. And so no matter how good the sensor itself gets, we're still dealing with the fact that that combine is bringing in crop from whatever width your header is on the front of that machine and doing a lot of mixing from the cutter bar until the point it hits that clean grain elevator. So when you really reflect on it, that's what we want to do today, is the reality of what that data can tell us based off of how it was collected and just the machine dynamics going on around that sensor.
Yeah, and I think about, John, you mentioned like target spray technology. We're so used to things being so instantaneous today. Some of those target spray technologies are making inputting thousands of points in a second or something crazy like that. But we still have a lot of limitations as that grain moves through that combine. And are we getting the longer our combines are, does that impact how instantaneous that data is too? So if we move to bigger combines, we're actually kind of moving backwards somewhat?
Well, we've definitely gone backwards when we talk about yield monitor data, probably the quality of it, and really what we're getting down to is the resolution. And so if we back up 20 years ago, think about the size of combines available just in class. Class 6, class 7 combine was probably the biggest. We forward to today, now we're talking about class 10 combines. We talk about headers, probably back 20 years ago, 6-row, 8-row were pretty big. Today, 8-row and 12-row is pretty common, and you can get a 16-row header today as well to harvest corn. And now we look at platforms just in the past few years. We rapidly went from 35 foot probably being big back 20 years ago to now 40, 45, 50 foot. We were running 50 foot with some cooperators last year. And if you happen to be at the Farm Science Review in 2023, there's a 62 foot one that was being demonstrated. So we're getting larger. And so the resolution, we've gone from 35 foot to, we'll say, 50 foot. That's another 15 foot. And we've gone from 6 to 12, in some cases doubled the width of harvest. And so our resolution has gone the opposite direction in terms of what we're trying to accomplish a lot of times in precision ag. And I just kind of get people thinking, but we look at the planter technology for those that are really have embraced precision ag and the planter technology. On these planters today, you almost know where every seed's getting planted. And the performance of each individual row. You have that data row by row. But yet we're combining, 12 a lot of times for corn rows and 40 plus foot headers for platform for soybeans and wheat.
Yeah, and I think when we're making those decisions, it's so easy to fall into the trap of you just overlay that yield map at the end of the season on top of all of your input maps, and you are lining up point by point, what you did with what the outcome was. And John, you've done some research here lately that demonstrates that approach is pretty risky in terms of data quality for decision making.
So I would tell people that are really using maps to analyze, and whether you're creating zones or making input decisions or fertility removal rates, those kinds of things, that you got to pay attention. There's some nuances today, right? When we think about soybeans in particular, we don't maybe harvest with the rows like we used to. We go at a 5-degree plus angle to try and allow that header to be as efficient as it can, and there's some value to that. But we're going at an angle versus how we planted it. So it depends on what you're trying to evaluate. You just got to remember at what angle relatively to how things were actually planted is pretty important to keep in mind. So that's a nuance that comes into play a lot of times. The other thing that we spent a lot of times, a couple years trying to understand it, is what resolution can we begin to inform. And so if I'm trying to go out, and whether I'm evaluating a planter, okay, and I'm saying, well, how this area perform versus this area, or if I've taken samples, whether that's a soil sample, tissue sample, and saying, hey, well, I want to attach, I know exactly where I pulled that sample and I want to attach a yield data. Well, can I just use the nearest yield point off that map and say that's the yield? The answer to that is no, not today. You got to remember, again, we're talking about anywhere from class 6 on a small side of combines up to class 8, 9s, and 10s are probably more reality a lot of places, that we're basically averaging yield over a large area to get a yield point. Okay, and so we did a lot of research to try and figure out what is the minimum area that I can use yield data to inform and attach yield to, especially if I'm doing some kind of research or I'm trying to evaluate where I collect the data, that you have to take a minimal area around that point or a certain length of yield data and average that in order to really reflect the average yield for that particular point or area. It's not taking instantaneous yield data and saying, yep, that one point represents that point, or, wherever I took. No, you can't do that. You have to, the combine is way too big today to begin to estimate exactly for that point and so we ran a lot of tests. We've published, I think, 3 papers out of that can really dive into the details of it. But, we found at minimum, you need 250 foot of yield monitor data. Really, the realities of that is the way we did that project, you probably need to be 300 to 400 foot, meaning I need 300, 400 foot of yield data to say that point or area that I'm trying to attach yield data to is actually the yield for that, and feel confident in that. If I use anything less, there's enough error in that data that I could be off. In some cases, approximately up to 23% is what we estimated. And so you have to have an area. 250 was, in a very controlled testing setting that we found, but reality would tell me, because of the operators and things and some other things, that regardless of combine size, it needs to probably be 300 to 400 foot of data. And so either need to draw a circle around a point or some kind of box and average yield data around that in that area in order to attach a yield data to that point or those areas.
Yeah, I think most farmers, that probably makes sense. As they're going through the field, they know they've gone through a really good area, and then they start to see it on their yield monitor. But when you're looking at it on your computer screen in the wintertime and making decisions, it's important to remember that key piece, because you might not be thinking about it in the same way.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of our data, right, is being handled by multiple. Again, a lot of data today with telematics was going up to, a cloud platform that companies are offering. I can download that and I generate a map. And so a lot of things that really happen in the field, maybe a different person's generating and using that map, and they don't know everything that went on out there during harvest, or had eyes on that crop to know exactly where things might have happened, and so it's pretty important.
Yeah. So to dive in a little bit, the way you collected that data and came to that conclusion, I think is kind of a cool story. So if you ever get the chance to see the maps from these plots, they laid out a checkerboard field with nitrogen treatments to simulate high and low yield. Well, not simulate, to create high and low yield zones, and made those different lengths, and then took a combine side by side, a commercial combine side by side with a plot combine, which captures those accumulated weights, and then tried to line up and see how accurately that yield monitor could match the accumulated weights from the plot combine. And looking at everything from, what was it, 50 feet?
25 was the start.
25 was the smallest.
Yeah, up to 400, actually 800 foot was simulating like a strip trial. If you're doing a whole strip through a field, the total plot was 1,000 feet, but 800 foot was our maximum plot length, down to 25 foot.
Yeah, so you had aerial imagery where you could see the green and yellow spots from the nitrogen treatments all the way down to that checkerboard of 25 feet. And then you could line that up with the yield map and see that the yield monitor just plowed through that and said, looks good, and created an average down that whole strip. And so it wasn't able to detect at 25 feet those differences.
That's right. In fact, the combine at 25 feet and even 50 feet, if you looked at yield monitor data, you could hardly see the high and low areas. I mean, it just showcases that you're averaging so much grain that a little, even that quick of a change was not changing the flow of grain, clean grain through that combine. And so it wasn't even hardly detecting until after you got above 50 feet. And even then, it could detect that there was low and high, but it wasn't getting to the actual yield in that plot or the low yield in that plot until we were getting out to the 200 plus feet. And it was really 200 feet where we started to see the confidence and say we were over 90% confident that the yield was in that length this. And so, again, we were very controlled in our research, the way we did that. And so I'm very skeptical in saying 250 is the minimum. It's really probably more 300 to 400 is the reality of it, based on how we operate these machines today.
Yeah, I mean, you are removing all that variability that we introduced by having to change speeds, stopping, all kinds of things that happen in the reality of harvesting a field that impacts the way that sensor is going to respond.
Yeah, and this question comes up every year, especially when I'm working with farmers new to doing on-farm research with us, is how long do the plots have to be? And now we have hard data to put to that. So it was really crucial for our on-farm research cooperators, and I appreciate you guys doing that work.
Yeah, it's very important. So, you think about the volume of research going on today, and whether that's with folks like us in academia and extension to industry, there's a lot of research that people are trying to comb through. Sometimes we do it at a strip level or block level, but some of it's at a field level. But again, if we're trying to draw and feel that we're confident on the conclusions out of all this, and no one's paying attention, nor are they dealing with the yield data, making sure that it's spatially been calibrated and the machine's operated in a certain way that collect quality data, and you got someone looking at data and they just process it. We don't know, there's potentially some errors in there or not. But the volume of research going on and the volume of processing yield data to inform input decisions and stuff, I think it would be mind-boggling to some people when you go and talk to some of the folks providing services, how many millions of acres they're processing. At the end of the day, it's very dependent on that combine operator to make sure that that technology is calibrated and operated in a way to collect quality data, so we're informing those decisions as best as possible.
Yeah, I think it's a little disappointing too. We have this conversation with cooperators that are really wanting to push the envelope on zone management. When we're looking at those yield maps, if your zones are smaller than that resolution, you're really taking a gamble on how accurate that yield data is and how it's going to line up with the decisions you're making. I know, Amanda, we've had situations where we're wanting to look at differences by soil type, and sometimes over a 250, 300 foot area in Ohio, some of those fields change soil types 2 or 3 times before we get to the end of that strip. And so, that urge is there to break it down to that subfield level And we can manage it when you look at your planter, your applicator, your sprayer. But again, that data that we're making that decision on, like you said, John, doesn't have the resolution. And then we're dealing with that challenge where it's the data that we're using to make the decision, and then it's also the data we're using to evaluate the outcome of that decision. Mm-hmm. So you're falling into this cycle of maybe misusing data or trusting it more than you really should be to make those high dollar decisions.
Yeah, and I think real quick, just for those of our listeners who have research plots out, if we could quickly do a few reminders on running that combine. So we think about, as you're going through that strip, trying not to stop, having a plan in place if you're going to have to dump, or dumping before you do that, especially if you're just uploading to the cloud and someone else is looking at it. What are some other tips you like to share with producers?
I think it happens, especially, you're running your soybeans, the pods are low, you're trying to pick up as much as you can. You pick up a rock, stopping happens. Mm-hmm. Every field might have a scenario where you run into that. And although it's not ideal, really the next step in that data processing approach is the cleaning step. And that's all of those issues, if we know they're in there, can be worked around through data cleaning and making sure that those impacts in the yield estimate aren't being continued on into the data and the decision making. Making sure that you're communicating with folks. I know for the eFields trials, when I do the cleaning, I always look at something other than yield, because the problem with the yield estimate is, again, because it's that calculation, some of those sudden changes can be masked by the fact that, yes, that sudden stop caused a bunch of material to move through the combine and it was attributed to a smaller spot. But because the calculation smooths that out to some degree, it's harder to see in the yield map. If you've got the software available, looking at other layers of that data, other attributes like speed, like swath width, can really help you pick out issues that otherwise are masked by the calculation. And so if you're a data cleaner, those would be my tips to start by looking at different attributes to look for issues. Taking meticulous notes is another one. It's easy to forget when you open that yield data 2 months later what happened in that field, especially if it was a traumatic rock experience. I know I try to forget about those immediately. So making notes, maybe even marking on your phone the area where it was at, so that you can go back later and make sure you deal with those issues in your data.
Yeah, I think the note taking is pretty important, especially if you're using this data. But hey, my last swath width, I forgot to change the header width, and I don't have the technology. And so, why is that yield data half of what it's around at? And so, again, if someone else is processing that, they don't know that information. And so you can say, hey, that last pass, I forgot to change the swath width, or we had some issue that cropped up we didn't know about, but it was actually influencing some things. Having those notes. We used, there's a nice feature in most of these yield monitors where you can drop flags. And so, those are good ways to drop a flag, type in a quick note. A lot of these combines are using auto guidance. So there's the capacity to take, a little bit of notes to help in this post-processing. I think growers need to also ask if they're writing big checks for inputs and yield data is going in to inform how much we're going to put on a field or not. Ask your service provider how they clean data, or are they cleaning data? And if so, have a little insight of how they're doing that. I know when I harvest, we've tried to do the best, but, we still get maps in our on-farm research that, the header, the on and off, it didn't shut off. And so every turn, or in some areas where point rows are, you got all these, underestimated or zeros that you just got to get out of there, because they aren't truly reflective of the yield in those areas. And so we still get to see, it's pretty obvious, at least for people that use yield data, some of these areas are pretty apparent, some of them aren't. That's why you take the notes. But to try and make sure that before you kind of do this post-harvest analysis with the data to create newer maps, are they doing some kind of cleaning, or does the software have capabilities to do some of that? Some of them do and do pretty decent. Some of them don't. But and I get it takes time, but I mean, again, we're writing checks, or you guys are, the farmers. I think you want to be as accurate as you can, and it just seems like as we go on and on, we're in 2025 today, but we're just can't continue on. Yield monitor data is just getting used more and more for other things, and we're going to add, not to get into what the future's bringing, but I've seen some pretty cool stuff coming out that we're going to add more information to the combine, or collect more information along, and it's just going to be interesting, how this. We're just going to be using the data more and more in the future, I guess what I'm getting down to.
Yeah, I'm so excited. We've seen so many technology advancements. You mentioned earlier on planters, on sprayers, on fertilizer spreaders. We haven't seen really fundamental changes on yield monitors and combines in quite some time.
Well, there's some groups of us that get together occasionally and have these, chats. And, the reality is, where we're at today, especially with planters and even some of our application equipment, the See and Spray included, as an example, that when are we going to get the row by row kind of yield monitoring system to be able to do some of this analysis? Because I knew when I planted that crop, for some reason something went wrong with a portion of the planter, let's say, or I at least had some differences in the performance in that area, and my combine's just too big. I can't pull out and do any analysis. But we talk a lot about it. At what point are we going to be able to get yield data resolution back to be able to analyze, whether we're collecting additional data on that crop, which I see in the near future with some of the technology coming. We're going to have to make something in the future if we're really going to be serious about moving precision ag ahead.
So we talked about ensuring that we have a long enough pass to be accurate, really 300 to 400 feet. Are there other things you've seen yield data, or other ways you've seen yield data misused that we should bring to our listeners' attention? Or is that really the biggest thing?
Well, I think if we're going to be calculating yield and trying to pinpoint it to some spatial area or point, that you got to keep that in mind. As you mentioned, a couple questions that come up frequently when we talk about the research we did. What does ground speed influence the mass flow estimate? So if I run 5.5 miles an hour, but then I slow down to 4 miles an hour for whatever reason, does that have an impact? We found that no, it doesn't. As long as it's calibrated, and we talked about this in episode 1, and we can map out that curvilinear response out of that mass flow sensor, ground speed will not influence yield estimates. Okay, and so that's one thing that just mentioned. Now, that's not saying that you should go down if you're trying to do, if you're in a research plot that's inside and within the field, you should be, messing with the joystick. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that if I harvested at 5.5 miles an hour, get the same quality data as I do at 4.5 or 4 miles an hour. You can do that. So that's a question that comes up. We and that makes sense in my mind, and I think we just collected the data to prove that point. So that's not a big thing as long as it's appropriately calibrated, the mass flow sensor. The other thing that comes up is the area calculation becomes important. Again, we can put in numbers manually and say, I'm taking 8 rows or 12 rows or whatever that might be. But I'm telling you that if you're using platforms and you're really conscious, you got to be conscious of making sure that area, the width of cut in particular, I see that as being a problematic area. We can, and that's evident if you're doing point rows and it's doesn't have that auto adjustment on it. You can see point rows all over the place in terms of yield estimates, and the reason is that the area estimate is incorrect. It thinks it's taking 8 rows. You're really taking 4, then 3, then 2, and then 1, and so all that. And so a lot of times that area estimate is a huge impact on that yield calculation, and a lot of times that's overlooked. So just whether you're running in point rows or adjusting, I took a swath and I only took a portion of the header and I didn't adjust. Those kinds of things come out pretty quick. The other big thing that we don't talk about enough, and you need to be thinking about in becoming more prevalent, is running multiple combines in the field. And again, I'll go back to what I said in the first session. Every combine sensor operator combination is different. Regardless if it's the same exact combine and two different operators, calibrating those with each of the operators and getting them calibrated is very important. But I'll tell you, depends on how you harvest the field and if you're trying to learn something. And so if I've got a project in portions of the field, I would tell you right now, use one of the combines. I would not try to be, every other pass or coming back from one side and the other side with the two combines or multiple. I would, for those areas that are important that you're trying to learn something from, use one combine. That really eliminates the differences that potentially could exist. And for example, we had a project last year where that very scenario happened, where one combine was set up and calibrated, and we had the header appropriately set in terms of the width. The other one was calibrated, but we had the wrong width in. And then it changed, but we didn't know exactly. We kind of knew where it changed, but you're going back through and like, well, you got adjacent passes, one saying, 250 bushel, 260, and the other pass is saying 220 to 200. And it's like, something's not right. And so my point in all that's another comment. If you're really interested, I'm not saying we can't get by with not using, you got to use two combines, you got to be efficient. But if you're trying to learn something, I would encourage, let one do one half the field potentially and the other one do the other half. Don't try and mix passes unless it's justified. They're just something to watch out, because each of them could have a little bit differences in how they, that yield map. Reach out to us. We could probably dive into this even more, but I think the importance of why we're talking about this, and I know people get tired of saying, well, you got to calibrate. Well, what's that mean? Well, at the end of the day, the most important thing is here, checks are being written based on yield monitor data, no doubt about it. The spatial maps. And if that's the case, then that data layer is pretty important in terms of informing decisions. And as we move forward, even with some of the new technology coming out in terms of modeling and stuff, these maps are going to play even a bigger role in doing predictions and estimates and things along those. I'm hoping that with some of the new research that's going on, we'll improve the yield maps. We talked about the limitations, right, here in kind of the second part of this, but until then, we're kind of left with the cards we're dealt. Yield monitors work. If they're properly managed, they can inform us, but they do have limitations, and we want to keep those in mind. And so we've got to keep that at the forefront of my mind. Is we're overlooking a lot of this, but yet we're using this data and trying to say that we're doing these data-driven decisions, but we didn't take the time to ensure the data going into that is accurate. And so a lot of times people talk about garbage in, garbage out, and I think if you get some people in here, they tell you, yeah, sometimes we're providing, what the farmers ask, but we're only using the data they provided us, and that's the best we can. And so the farmer or the operator of that machine is very critical in order to ensure that we're collecting data that's of value in order to inform some of these decisions that we see more and more being based on yield monitor data.
Yeah, so bottom line, if you're writing a $50,000 check for inputs based on yield monitor data, how confident are you that you're spending your money effectively?
Or I'm writing a $250,000 check or $750,000 check. I want to make sure that, especially where we are with margins, that we're doing that as confidently as possible.
All right. Well, thank you both for your insight on this topic. And again, if you have questions, feel free to reach out, and we'll put some resources in the show notes for you all. Have a safe harvest.
Thanks for listening to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Join us again in 2 weeks for our next episode.